how a REC's value is determined. So we have two markets, the voluntary market and the compliance market. So in the voluntary market, buyers are not being forced into making these purchases. The type, origin, and amount are determined on a case-by-case basis. Certification standards include greening, and there are retail providers such as Sterling Planet, 3 Degrees, Native Energy, et cetera, et cetera. And prices for RECs in this market are generally lower than in the compliance markets for RECs of the same type. And the volume in the voluntary market is pretty substantial on a per megawatt hour basis nationwide. So, some utilities also use a voluntary market through green power programs with residents and businesses.
Okay, so we're AEP customers down in Southeast Ohio, and this is the flyer that I actually received when AEP started becoming a supplier of these RECs to their customers. And you'll notice here that what's being sold by electricity, by AEP in this case, is not electricity. That's totally separate. That's a separate bill that you receive for that. This is a green power block, and that's essentially repackaged RECs that they've purchased in bulk. And in this case, they were charging about $7 per renewable energy certificate, and this was before Ohio's RPS standard was passed. So in this voluntary market, you can imagine that a business, for example, like this ice cream shop that might be connected to a coal-fired power plant, can actually buy their megawatt hours of electricity off of the regular grid, and then they can also buy a whole big pile of green t-shirts from some renewable energy provider. And essentially they marry the two components of the green power back together, the electrons plus the environmental benefits associated with how certain electrons somewhere were generated. So once they do this, they can actually legitimately claim to be using solar power or green power, even though the electrons that they're making use of did not come directly from a renewable energy source. And this voluntary REC market is the one we make use of when we buy RECs to satisfy requirements associated with the President's climate commitment or LEED for green power, and that's the one that we use. Now, as a result of the fact that these environmental benefits have now been sold off to this ice cream shop, effectively, the power that's actually flowing to this house is no longer green for all intents and purposes. Okay, even though the electrons that are actually flowing from the solar array are still flowing over to the house. And in that way, we avoid any double counting of environmental benefits, and we don't have a situation where we have double bragging rights. So Drew's going to tell you a little bit more now about the compliance market for RECs.
All right, so the compliance market is a little bit different. It's policy driven, primarily on the state level, through a renewable portfolio standard or executive order from the government or something of that sort. It's a mandate on the utilities, essentially. So the policies vary from state to state, from agency to agency, and registration and verification systems also vary. Prices in this market can be high or substantially high. For example, in Ohio, a solar REC can be sold for upwards of $300 per megawatt hour. And so there are a lot of retailers, brokers, and suppliers in this market, including the ones that I mentioned on the left. And projects themselves can be direct suppliers of these RECs. And so here's a little Venn diagram to just kind of talk about the interactions between these markets, because I think that's a really difficult thing for a lot of people to grasp. So in the center, we have a circle that represents the national voluntary market by greening. And then in the circles around, we have what are the compliance markets represented by the acronyms at the top. You see PJM, NEPOOL, MRO, et cetera. Those are the power pools that encompass the states where those compliance markets exist and where those RECs are produced. So those all vary in value depending on policy and market conditions. And as you see by the overlap, there's some room to sell RECs from one market into the other. And as you can see from the arrows, for example, if I'm a wind farm in Ohio, I can sell them into the Ohio compliance market in PJM, or I could sell them into another compliance market, let's say in a state in the MRO. So it really depends. Okay. And just to sum it up, I mean, these two markets interact a lot, just in the sense that They provide multiple revenue streams and timescales to sell RECs to product developers, and they can provide an alternative for excess RECs that utilities accrue on top of their RPS mandates. And the main thing to be said here is that RECs can be sold into either the voluntary compliance market, in the case of Ohio, not both.
Okay, let's talk about these on-campus renewable energy systems now. Why do we like them so much? Because they're a visible manifestation to our commitment to sustainability and many of the other reasons that we cited on that first slide. And note that they don't have to be solar arrays, obviously. It could be any kind of renewable energy system. So we have a number of options when it comes to financing these systems. And basically, you can understand these as either self-financed or third-party financed. When you self-finance a system, you own the system after it's installed. The funding can come from any number of sources flowing through the university. And by default, that electricity that's provided and the RECs belong to the university. So, for example, when you have one of these on-campus systems and you own it, you can also count it in your greenhouse gas emissions inventory as green power. You might also be able to claim credit for it under LEED, under the on-site renewable energy credit, because if it's co-located with a facility that you're certifying. And you're able to tell anybody who's willing to listen that your campus is making use of green, clean power. That's correct. Now, with third-party financing, the third party actually owns the system once it's installed. Funding is derived from a number of different sources, which we're going to go into in just a second. There's always a power purchase agreement where you're agreeing to buy the electrons themselves that have been stripped of renewable energy benefits. And then the electricity themselves and the RECs are in the control of the party that actually owns the array. So, in these kinds of cases, what are these financial opportunities for developers? Well, they have free access to your land or your roof space, and oftentimes it's land that's actually pretty suitable for other types of development. They're getting federal and state tax credits. They're getting grants that they're using you to leverage. They might also be getting state subsidies, as they do in Ohio. They're getting the power purchase agreement. They're getting access to low-income capital, again, using you to leverage that because you've agreed to pay for the electrons. They're getting, oftentimes, an agreement by the university to actually buy the equipment off of them after it's significantly depreciated in value, and they are selling those renewable energy certificates off. That's how these deals work. Okay, so what are the implications if you pay yourself? You get the bragging rights. You're reducing your carbon footprint. You own the renewable electricity. You can report it as such on your GHG inventory. You have complete control. You can potentially receive credit under LEED, Energy and Atmosphere Credit 2. And I'm actually not going to spend time on Credit 2, but if you want to talk about it in the question and answer, we can deal with how on-site renewable energy and green power are different in LEED. When you have a third-party financing agreement, you cannot take credit for the system in your GHG inventory, as explained by the President's climate commitment folks themselves. You're not reducing your own institution's carbon footprint. You have to pay for the electricity that's been stripped of its environmental benefits. You can't choose who's buying the RECs, and you may not qualify for certain credits under LEED. So this is essentially the situation, and if you want to buy those RECs associated with that on-campus system, you're going to have to pay fair market value for them, because that's what the utilities are paying for them, and that just may be completely unaffordable for your campus. So let's take a closer look at what's happening with a third-party owned system on your campus. Let's look a little closer. Well, essentially, those green t-shirts are being sold off. That's part of the deal. So is it really appropriate to say our degrees are now solar powered, or make claims about green power under those circumstances? Probably not. In fact, this is a document I obtained from a legal firm, and in Ohio, law firm that was responding to concerns by a college in Ohio that was saying, we don't know what we are going to be able to say or not say about this system since it's owned by a third party. They were very clear, once RECs are sold, the energy associated with those RECs is no longer green, and certain statements about environmental attributes can no longer be made. Essentially what you can say is just, well, this thing is located on our campus, it's producing X amount of electricity every year, we are hosting this system, but you have to be pretty careful about that. And to what extent is your campus community really going to be able to understand those communications? I mean, is that a reasonable expectation? So we are making this following argument. Do not sell or seed your RECs. Why? Keep the relationship clear and simple. The President's climate commitment are your marching orders, or whatever climate commitment you've made with your campus. You have to stick to them. Why? Because any time you spend working on these kinds of projects is time that you don't spend working on your institution serving to weaken the president's climate commitment. And that's not something that the president's climate commitment folks would necessarily say. In fact, I've heard them say we would never say that, but I'm saying it. And we're giving away too much to the developers. In Ohio, they're lining their pockets. They're not doing it as part of some kind of public service arrangement. They're making big money off of these systems. You can get your own utility savings by owning it. You can drive your utilities actually to make more substantial investments in states that have RPSs by actually holding the RECs instead of allowing them to buy them off you. You're preserving the public credibility of the REC markets, which is very important. You're retaining future flexibility regarding the environmental benefits of your system, and you're getting the credit and value you deserve from these campus system. And finally,
you have about 30 seconds.
It's just really important just to be as sophisticated as you can in these conversations. So research your RPS and everything that applies to you as a campus. Understand the tax incentives that you would get from the project, and understand that if the developers are writing grants through foundations with your involvement, make sure it goes through to you and not them, or at least not them, but that you get part of the money. And just don't pay more for plain old power, especially when a utility is trying to, or when the developer is trying to insinuate that it's green power, yet you don't have the REC. It doesn't make any sense. So specify exactly what is or what is not being ceded, and don't make claims that can't be supported. And lastly, just beware of the claims that they're making. And you know, in our experience, they've been very misinformed and misleading. So that's about it. Thank you.